After the first astronauts reached heaven, the only god discovered in residence retired to a little brick cottage in the vicinity of Venus. He was not unduly surprised. He had seen it coming since Luther, and besides, what with the imminence of nuclear war, his job was nearly over. Once the fantastic had become a commonplace, bus tours were organized, and once or twice a day the old fellow would be trotted out from his reading of Dante and asked to do a few tricks. Lightning bolts, water spouting from a rock, blood from a turnip. A few of the remaining cherubim would fly in figure eights and afterwards sell apples from the famous orchard. In the evening sometimes the retired god would receive a visit from his old friend the devil. They would smoke their pipes before the fire. The devil would stroke his whiskers and cover his paws with his long furry tail. The mistake, he was fond of saying, was to make them in your image instead of mine. Possibly, said the ex-deity. He hated arguing. The mistake, he had often thought, was to experiment with animal life in the first place when his particular talent was as a gardener. How pleasant Eden had been in those early days with its neat rows of cabbages and beets, flowering quince, 100 varieties of rose. But then of course he needed the insects, and then he made the birds, the red ones which he loved. Later came his experiments with smaller mammals, squirrels and moles, a rabbit or two. When the temptation had struck him to make something really big, he had first conceived of it as a kind of scarecrow to stand in the middle of the garden and frighten off predators. What voice had he listened to that convinced him to give it his own face? No voice but his own. It had amused him to make a kind of living mirror, a little homunculus that could learn a few of his lesser tricks, and he imagined sitting with his friend the devil, watching the little human creatures frolic in the grass. They would be like children, good-natured and singing all the time. When had he realized his mistake? Perhaps when he smiled down at the first and it didn't smile back. When he reached down to help it to its feet and it shrugged his hand aside. Standing up, it had not walked on the paths marked with white stones, but on the flowers themselves. It's lonely, God had said, and he made the mate, then watched them feed on each other's bodies, bicker and fight and trample through his garden, dissatisfied with everything and wanting to escape. Naturally, he hadn't objected. Kicked out? Kicked out? Who had spread such lies? Shaking and banging the bars of the great gate, they had begged him for the chance to make it on their own.